Hey guys, today I'm gonna show you how to use the PrayMitive plugin. The PrayMitive plugin is applied to the solid layer, just like all standard effect plugins. Once you apply it, you can immediately add a new primitive by clicking the Add button. Note that primitives are applied to the 3D null layer, meaning you need to create one. So let's create layer new null object, make it 3D is necessary, and for convenience give it a name, primitive number 1. Now selecting it here and we will see our primitive. However, if we select a non-3D layer here, the primitive won't be displayed. Each primitive has many parameters, but let's move on the main environment parameters for now. Here. By default, when there are no light sources, PrayMitive creates a kind of ambient light directed from top to bottom. The top part is currently white, while the bottom is black. You can, for instance, make them both darker, like this. And you can also change the ambient center bias parameter. It move this border of lights from bottom to top. So let's add a light source of type point. Here we select point. We can also change intensity later. Now we have a daylight, but let's also create a camera to reset this view, because without camera I a little bit changed my view and now I don't like it. Let's position it attractively now. In fact, you can duplicate several such sources. This will create more detailed light, but remember that our sphere is white now, so we are illuminating a white object now. If we want to make something black or of a different color, the result might not be to our liking. So you might want to select a different diffuse color to your preference now. We can also adjust the color of light sources. But in After Effects, there's a peculiarity when we change the light color, we don't immediately see the result. But there is a trick. We can add a working layer and insert color control here. Let's make this layer the 3D, and we also name it as scene, for example, and we can make this layer the parent of light sources as well. Now we can attach the color of light sources to this color control by expressions, and we can now change the color and see the result immediately. This is a trick. Let's make the same for all colors. For example, call it light 1, light 2, light 3, light 4, and attach each light sources to each color control. Oh, we mess up with something. Now it's okay. Let's change the colors of lights to make it more interesting looking. And also we can change the intensity of light sources as well. For light sources, I also recommend adjusting the radius, as it will influence the size of this specular highlight. But remember that for each primitive, you can adjust the specular highlight size right in the material settings, here in shininess option. You can also adjust the intensity of specular highlights and their overall color. By the way, the diffusion intensity affects the blend of ambient light with diffuse color. But even if it's set to 0, the material color remains. Keep that in mind. To completely remove the color, you need to make it black here. Let's again a little bit adjust the lights of our scene. Next, there is a cool feature in PrayMitive plugin to use environment maps in equirectangular projection. I already have one prepared in environment layer, and it's actually a composition with some image. But I recommend not making them too large, this composition. And by the way, you can animate also the internals of this composition, and it will also be reflected in the plugin. You can also blur the texture, for example with fast box blur, and we can select the environment map here, but you can see here this seam, since our map are in equirectangular projection. Beware of that, however, immersive video here this plugin category has plugins that allow blurring for such projections. You can do it like this. Now the seam is almost invisible. The black strip is caused by the texture stretching over the entire sphere. This is due to the texture being reduced in terms of size. If this is critical for you, you can change it by changing the width and height of texture or for composition. But for most cases, this shouldn't be a problem. The environment map can be also toggled off from view. But turning it off doesn't greatly affect performance. If you want performance, just turn it off here. Also, if you notice a drop in performance, I recommend clearing the cache. I do it like this by shortcut. It is this command, all memory and this cache. And in general, I suggest setting a hotkey for cache clearing. It's very, very convenient. Just like this, you typing cache and attach the shortcut here, and then you can empty by these shortcuts. So, but why do we need an environment map? Of course, for reflections. To do this, increase the glossiness intensity here, and also we need to turn on the environment map here, and we immediately see the reflections appeared at the edges of the sphere. How much it will be on the edges, it's controlled by the Fresnel edge bias parameter. And the central bias controls the lowest reflection point. So this black part becomes a bit more glossy. There is also a fantastic rim parameter that adds a counter glow. It's multicolored now, thanks to the normal maps. Let's remove the glossiness to 0 and adjust the Fresnel of rim light options, so that this color completely fills the primitive. Each color essentially indicates along which axis each pixel from this sphere is looking. This filling of normal with color can also be adjusted by the colorized normal mix parameter. And instead, for instance, set some other color, rim color. But in my opinion, using normals gives a more interesting picture. Also, you can mix with the rim color normals with the rim color, for example, making a little bit slighter blue. Remember, in remeshing there are no polygons, so 3D objects are generated before our eyes, allowing mathematical operations without thinking about polygon. For example, you can add cosine waves by adjusting the amplitude and frequency of the wave, as well as the rotation of the modifier itself. And now you can notice that it seems like the sphere is spinning. Actually does. It's an illusion that the sphere is rotating. And to prove it that it is illusion, we can choose another primitive, for example, capsule, and then again change the rotation, and we can see that actually waves rotate. You can also add a sine wave and overlay it parallel to the cosine for a more interesting effect, like this. Also note that when the wave frequency or amplitude are too high, we see artifacts caused by the technology. Partly we can counteract this in the settings by adjusting the precision multiplier parameter. Here in global settings, in remarching, this one we can make it less, and we will see something better and better. But now is frequency too high. Let me change them. Okay, now it's better, but also you can see now that too small value of precision multiplier parameters is also bad, because to some extent we multiply it by transparency and can see such edges. So I recommend not make the frequency or amplitude too high. And it's also cool when you apply an expression for the wave offset to make kind of animation. I just made an expression here, and we can multiply time by 180, and then, for example, 4. And we can see this wave is now animating. Also, we can animate the sine as well. By here, we can multiply 180 by 2. Oh, now it's too fast. Let's make it less. Now you see kind of wavy surface. Besides waves, there's also a ripples parameter. It's similar, but the wave comes from the center. Let's switch off the wave to see the ripples more clearer. And you can animate again the offset as well. There is also the twist, which, as the name suggests, twists the object like this. Note that if we have a sphere and no other modifier, we won't see much of the effect of this modifier, even if we change the rotation of twist. But we can see it on all non-symmetrical objects, especially on box. The last modifier here is bend. We can adjust it by strength and also rotate the x-axis using the x rotation parameter, because the orientation of the bend modifier is currently incorrect relative to the current primitive. You see, we can also change the y parameter or z parameter, and again it's not correct. So for this case, correct is 90. But anyway, we can see some artifacts in some angles of the bend orientation, which is unfortunately due to an algorithm flaw, but it's actually the best bend algorithm I could find. Again, we can sort of offset these artifacts using the precision multiplier. Also note that the scale of the primitive's null layer can also add or reduce artifacts, but it also might reduce the performance too, so we have to choose. Although this time, as you can see, it didn't give me a huge performance loss. Here's also another interesting thing, is that all modifiers take the anchor point of the null layer as a reference point. This means it can be changed to achieve more interesting effects. For example, we can make sort of a worm. Also, with this kind of artifacts, I assume a precision multiplier won't help here, but let's see. It can help you a little bit, but not too much, you know, because here we have a problem due to the algorithm of bend. This is sort of end point of the bend strength, like a dead end. Look, after applying all modifiers, we see a performance drop. Also, the more pixels the object occupies, the lower the performance. And also we see the drops in the performance due to the low value of precision multiplier. We can make it a little bit higher. It causes a little bit artifacts in some bend values. But again, we can balance with this parameter to get the more performance as we can. If it's for you not necessary, I recommend disable environment. Again, this make huge performance increase. Let's look at the remaining parameters. Steps here simply change the number of rays that can come out the camera, and they create all the magic. Actually, 255 is generally an optimal number. Any more reduces the performance again, but not so much. Ray proximity threshold affects to many factors. Mainly, it determines how close the collision of the ray with the object will be considered. In some cases, for example, with reflections, it plays a bigger role. Here I think it's clear that clip distance affects how far the ray will fly. This parameter also affects depth, which I'll show you later. Let's move on to the shadows and reflections category. You see, if I increase the bend strength parameter here and also remove the Fresnel edge bias in the glossiness options, we immediately see how the sides reflect off each other. Here, max reflections determines how many times reflection will occur. The higher the value, the more performance drops. But overall, we need more primitives to showcase these parameters. Let's move on to the primitive controls. In addition to just adding a primitive through the add button, I'll delete it for now. You can also duplicate one using the green button. This button allows you to copy each parameter from one primitive to another. Let's create another null object. For instance, we can keep the name auto-generated one, this one, primitive2. And let's select here that new null object. Now we see two primitives. And let's also remove unnecessary modifiers and maybe change parameters a little bit. Now we can copy these parameters that we modified from one primitive. This button became yellow because now we have those parameters in the clipboard. Again, this button allows you copy all parameters of current primitive in the clipboard, and then you can paste it here like this. You can also change the material and so on, copy and then paste. It's the same operations, but let's return it to black color. Also, I'll change one primitive to a sphere to better see the reflections. And now you can see that the primitives begin to reflect each other. Let's create for now a floor. We duplicate this primitive null layer. Let's push it down. Then I will, in this time, add new primitive by clicking the add button. And here I choose, for example, cylinder and primitive 3. Let's also call this primitive 3 floor. Something happened here. We have a bend parameter. Apparently some parameters were kept from before. Let's simulate the floor. We make big diameter and height 0 is okay. Also, I don't like a lot of reflections. Maybe 2 will be pretty enough. So I want to clean the cache. And maybe for this time, I want to remove reflections because I want to show you the shadows. Let me tweak some parameters, some colors also. And see, due to the light, we have a bluish or pinkish color on the floor, despite the gray one here. But it doesn't matter for now, because I want to show you the shadows. I just enabled it, and you can see the shadows will appear on the floor as well on the objects. Note that shadows are quite a resource-intensive feature in ray marching, but you can adjust them to be a bit cheaper. For instance, now shadow steps is 255. We can reduce it, for example, to 5. The less we set this parameter, the better performance we will have. Then we can tweak the shadow quality a little bit less. And what do we see here? At this point, there is a sort of space between where the ray merely seems to collide with the object, making this stripe larger. The ray thinks it's passed through the object, but in reality there is still some distance to it. This value gets rounded off, and the shadow may disappear where it should actually be. And this distance is made too big due to the proximity threshold. I hope you understood the idea. But in some cases it makes sense. But when your objects are too near to each other, this could be a disadvantage in some cases. And shadow quality actually affects how sharply these shadows will be drawn. But this only works with a large number of shadow steps. When working with a small amount, we're forced to accept some limitations. Let's disable it for now. And I want to show you the next feature. And also I forgot to mention another feature. You can arrange the primitives in the list. So let's move the cylinder above the capsule and even the sphere. However, it might be unnoticeable until we start working with the operations. Now I want to back to the talk about operations. Let's transform a cylinder with 0 height into a cylinder with some height. And now also the time has come to tell a little bit more about steps, because you see here, this is disadvantage of ray marching, but we could avoid it by increase the steps parameter. The less it is, the more we see these edge artifacts. Let's increase it something like this, I guess. And now we can tweak the smooth parameter. Now here we have a capsule, this blue one capsule. I increase the smooth, and we see how it will merge into the cylinder in this case. But actually this smooth operation, I wanted to say operation itself, works with the previous primitives. For example, when we increase the smooth, we smooth it with the sphere and the cylinder. But if we change smooth at the cylinder, it not affects at all, because this one is first one primitive in our groups. At the same time, we see that material settings also blend. For example, if we turn on, for example, environment, make reflections, for example, 1. And if we increase glossiness here, we will see that this material setting slightly transitions from one to the other. This is the union operations, but you can also see what happens if you subtract one primitive from another. Now we subtract last primitive capsule from all previous primitives. You can see this better if, for example, we turn off the cylinder and leave the other primitives moving the capsule inside the sphere. And we see how one subtract from other. And also our material blend in this situation too. And because of this, we can achieve some interesting variations of the primitives. But besides subtract, we also have the intersection operation. And again, by tweaking the smooth parameter and positioning objects, we can again achieve some interesting forms of primitives. Let's keep the subtract option, but for the capsule, let's reduce the smooth parameter slightly. Also, we can tweak the capsule itself. And I want to show you another important parameter is ambient occlusion. It's more convenient to adjust it when you've chosen it alone for viewing in render mode. Here in render mode, I choosing the ambient occlusion, and we will see now it is black. It is because of precision multiplier. First of all, unfortunately now precision multiplier also affects on ambient occlusion, and I'm still thinking about how to logically have it adjusted within the occlusion parameters separately. But back to the ambient occlusion, the aim of AO, ambient occlusion, is to give a more realistic look by simulating the lack of lights in folds or corners where light theoretically will pass less. Let's also change the threshold, and we can also change the intensity. Then again, we return to beauty. What we don't see anything because of the parameter enabled is disabled. Now you see how ambient occlusion affect to our primitives. Also, we can union capsule with the sphere and can see how ambient occlusion affects on the folds. We can also make the folds by the modifier, for example, ripple. These black ones, this is ambient occlusion, you see. And if we do the less precision multiplier, we also kind of multiply the intensity of ambient occlusion. But back to the render mode, there's also a parameter for viewing normals. We can select the normal, and what it can do, we can, for example, use this when you want to add a displacement map effect. This will create semblance of refraction. Let's add displacement map, and here select the PrayMitive. Then we turn off the PrayMitive, and we will see nothing because we haven't selected effects and masks. And now we see how the normal maps affects to the environment map, our layer, but it's stretched. So we need to change this displacement map behavior to stretch map to fit. And now it's okay. It's looking okay. And this will really create a semblance of refraction. There's also, besides normal depth render mode, which can be adjusted with the parameter I mentioned earlier, max clip distance. You see, this is determines the last white point of depth map. How we again can use it. For instance, we can duplicate it. One layer we have with the depth render mode, and here we have a beauty render mode. Beauty, this means ordinary render view. So one with the beauty, one with the depth. And then we can simulate the depth of field effect with the camera lens blur effect. Here we choose again the PrayMitive, but I don't know which one. Let's call this depth, and then in adjustment layer, just select PrayMitive depth, then effects and mask, it's necessary, and then we can blur it. And we see how it's blurring, but independent of layers positions, but we can tweak the blur focal distance to see that kind of depth of field effect. Also, we can use it as a fog effect for example, by the screen mode, by changing the screen mode. We can also tweak the max clip distance. And we see we have here a kind of haze, semblance of fog. There's also one more thing. The last one, how to most efficiently and least resource intensively implement anti-aliasing in PrayMitive. Right now it seems very computationally intensive to me, but I have ideas on how to simplify it without losing too much quality. For now I haven't added it yet and recommend the following method to create anti-aliasing. Go to the solid settings, and here's a trick. With the log aspect ratio enabled, multiply the size by 2 or 3 or even 2.5, something like this. For example, I will multiply by 3. Then I can press Command Alt F in my case, or in the layer transform, you can choose fit to comp. This basically the same. And now we have a kind of anti-aliasing, and this works very well. This gives you a little bit lack of performance, actually not a little bit, but you can work with it, for example, in the pre-last rendering moment when you want to render the final video. But for now, that's all. I wish you a successful creation of abstract artistic works using the PrayMitive plugin. I really hope to see your creativity online. Also, if it's possible for you, please share with me what you achieve with the PrayMitive plugin. I will be glad to it. So thank you so much and happy using the PrayMitive plugin. Bye bye.